Hey guys, tonight we walk into a place where time feels like warm stone underfoot. You're not scrolling through a feed or checking your emails. You're stepping into a sun-bleached plaza in ancient Athens. The columns around you rise like frozen music, and the air smells like crushed time and dusty parchment. Sandals slap gently against marble. Philosophers mumble to themselves beneath fig trees. And you? You're just trying not to trip over a sleeping dog. Welcome to the Agora Marketplace, Debating Hall, and Outdoor Therapist's office all in one. This is where Socrates annoyed people for a living and Plato took notes in the background. It's also where tonight's story begins. A long, slow stroll through why the greatest minds of ancient Greece believed your 50s weren't just acceptable, they were ideal. Golden, even. That might sound great, or it might sound like something only old people say to feel better. Either way, you probably won't survive this intellectually, because if you've been coasting on vibes alone, the Greeks are about to call you out. Hard. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're feeling brave, drop your location and local time in the comments. I'd love to see who else is out here wandering the marble gardens of history. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You walk past a statue. Her eyes are blank marble, but she's watching. Always watching. She doesn't judge your outfit. She's seen togas, after all, but she might judge your choices. Because in her time, they believed people weren't really ready to advise, lead, or philosophize until their 5th decade. Before that, you were too rash, too hormonal, too interested in wrestling. The ancient Greeks, especially the thinkers who shaped our ideas of ethics, reason, and the good life, didn't see aging as decay. They saw it as ripening. You weren't over the hill at 50. You became the hill, solid, unmovable, a vantage point for watching the rest stumble around below. Think about the structure of their world. City-states that thrived on argument, policy, and reflection. Sure, warriors were young, but the decision-makers? Gray-haired, bearded, often sunburnt. The elders didn't just have power. They had a certain glow about them, like a fire that had learned to burn low and steady. And in this first breath of night, you walk beside them. You pass men leaning on walking sticks who could outwit you before breakfast. You overhear a debate about justice that's been going on for 3 hours. The crowd listens, not because they agree, but because the speaker has seen 5 decades of sunrises and is still asking questions. In the center of the agora, someone's reciting Homer. Not the D.O. guy, the blind poet. People nod slowly, mouthing along. Here, wisdom isn't about having answers. It's about knowing which questions matter, and not caring if the answers are uncomfortable. That's the mindset we're about to explore, not from textbooks or dates, but from the rhythm of life that pulsed through these dusty streets. From the way old men scratched diagrams in the dirt with sticks and grinned like children discovering fire. From the half-jokes carved into amphory, mocking youth as beautiful but useless. Tonight, you'll meet philosophers who waited decades before publishing a word, leaders who only stepped forward after 50, and thinkers who saw time not as a thief, but as a sculptor, chiseling the human spirit into something sharp and strange and worthy. You pause at a fountain. The water's cold, ancient, alive. A boy runs past, laughing. He'll learn. Just give him a few decades. Because tonight's journey isn't just about Greeks. It's about you too. About seeing your own timeline not as a countdown but a climb. And at 50, you might just be reaching the view. A breeze rustles the olive trees. Somewhere, a flute plays a tune older than shame. You step into the shadow of a temple, and the night begins in earnest. You shuffle past a row of marble benches, half sitting before realizing one is still warm from its previous occupant. That occupant, probably some stooped fellow with a beard that looked like it had weathered wars, wasn't just resting. He was waiting for his moment to speak. Because in ancient Greece, if you were under 30, no one expected you to be taken seriously. And if you were under 50, well, you were still considered in development like a good cheese or a slightly undercooked thought. The age of reason wasn't just a phrase here. It was a calendar appointment. For the Greeks, the body may have peaked in youth, but the mind? That took a bit longer. And honestly, if you've ever looked back at your 20s and cringed, you already agree with them. There's a man sitting on a stone nearby, feeding a pigeon breadcrumbs and reciting geometry problems like they're lullabies. You think he might be a philosopher, or a baker with an eccentric hobby. Either way, he's comfortably in his 50s, and no one is interrupting him. Why? Because that's when, according to the Greeks, your passions begin to loosen their grip on your brain. You're no longer obsessed with proving things, or buying flashier sandals, or challenging strangers to wrestling matches. In fact, the Greek word sophrosyne, self-control, moderation, wisdom was practically synonymous with middle age. You had to live long enough to understand how little you actually knew, and then decide not to panic about it. Thinkers like Pythagoras and Anaxagoras, and even Thales weren't particularly loud in their early years. Many only began teaching or were taken seriously as teachers, well after they'd sprouted their first gray hairs. If you're thinking of this as ancient ageism in reverse, you're not wrong. Youth might have had beauty, strength, and the ability to party like Dionysus, but it lacked what the Greeks treasured most. Logos, that calm, ordered reason that doesn't jump to conclusions or off cliffs. Now, don't get too romantic about it. Greeks weren't enlightened about everything. They still excluded women, enslaved people, and anyone who wore trousers. But they did believe that wisdom had a clock, and it ticked toward 50 like a sundial inching toward shade. The agora begins to empty a little. People retreat into their homes, and you stay behind, surrounded by the soft hush of sandaled feet on stone. You think about the idea that your peak isn't behind you, it might be arriving right on schedule. Back then, 50 wasn't just a number. It was an achievement, a survival badge, a quiet signal that you'd been bruised by life, but not broken, that your impulses had been tamed into insight, and that maybe, just maybe, you could finally offer something useful to the world, not flashy, not fast, but true. You imagine Socrates walking by, muttering about the unexamined life. You picture him smirking at your phone and asking if you've examined that lately. You consider throwing it into a clay urn and joining a debate circle. Then you remember it's past midnight and you still haven't brushed your teeth. Still, the thought lingers. Could you become one of them? Not a philosopher in robes, maybe, but someone who slows down enough to ask better questions? Someone who's not desperate to prove a point, but curious enough to follow a thread of thought where it leads, even if it leads to awkward silences. After all, they didn't fear age. They feared foolishness. And foolishness, they believed, had a cure: time. Time spent reading, arguing, walking slowly, and realizing that no argument is ever really won. It's only ever left standing longer than the others. The last pigeon flutters off. The stars are old friends now. You lean back on the bench and imagine your mind like an ancient temple. Weathered, cracked, but still standing, still echoing, and just maybe beginning to ring with wisdom. The kind not filled with clanging dumbbells, but with the low hum of philosophical murmurs and the occasional grunt from an elderly man lifting what can only be described as an aggressively large amphora. This isn't a place for muscleheads. Not really. It's a palestra, where the body was trained not just for war, but for wisdom. And the older the athlete, the more attention he drew. Because, in the Greek worldview, maintaining strength into your 50s wasn't just impressive, it was moral. Enter stage left, Solon of Athens, lawmaker, poet,
proto-influencer.
He famously divided human life into 7-year increments. Think of it as the original life coach timeline. And according to him, it wasn't until the 7th stage, around age 50, that a man was finally wise enough to counsel others. Before that, just practice rounds. You didn't qualify for senior advising until your back occasionally cracked while tying your sandals. Solon's system wasn't some quirky Pinterest life hack. It was woven into the civic fabric. You couldn't even hold certain public offices in some city-states until you'd hit the half-century mark. Why? Because they didn't want rash decisions from people who still ordered wine just to impress their crush. They wanted deliberation, the kind only seasoned mistakes could teach you. And here's the kicker. Ancient Greeks loved lists and stages. They saw aging not as decline, but as unfolding. Like peeling layers off an onion. Except by the end you weren't crying, you were wise. Maybe still crying, but now for philosophical reasons. You wander deeper into the gymnasium and overhear two men debating the nature of justice. One in his 20s, loud and animated. The other in his 60s, slow and precise. The older one doesn't interrupt. He doesn't posture. He waits. And then, with a single sentence, unravels the entire argument like a loose toga thread. No applause. Just a nod from a nearby scribe who's probably been taking notes since dawn. This was the rhythm of age in Greece. Not louder, but deeper. Like wine settling in an amphora. Wisdom wasn't rushed. It took time to ferment. And not everyone agreed, of course. Historians still argue whether Solon's 7-stage life plan was prescriptive or descriptive. Was he telling people how to live or just describing what he saw? There's also debate over how universally accepted it was across all Greek city-states. Sparta, for example, had its own, let's call them more bicep-centric values. Still, Solon's influence stuck. Even Plato picked up the theme, laying out in the Republic that philosopher kings, those ideal rulers, shouldn't touch power until at least age 50. He didn't want idealism running a state. He wanted restraint, wisdom born of failure, a few regrets, maybe a bad investment in olive futures, definitely some awkward poetry phases. The gymnasium begins to empty. You stretch your legs, carefully, because even imaginary hamstrings can twinge, and follow a group of students heading toward a shaded courtyard. One of them, a gangly youth with too much enthusiasm and not enough eyebrows, is reciting a speech he hopes will impress the elders. It's ambitious, but the elders just listen, smile faintly, and wait their turn, because they know something he doesn't yet. There's no shortcut to being heard, just years of silence, watching, surviving, and quietly growing old enough that your words no longer need to shout to be remembered. You pause beneath a fig tree, watching sunlight flicker through the leaves like thoughts just barely catching form. Somewhere in the distance, a lyre plucks a slow tune. It's calming, steady, old, like the people it was meant for. And you, somewhere in this imagined Athens, begin to understand. The Greeks didn't just expect wisdom to come with age. They trusted it would. Not automatically, not without effort, but inevitably, like the turning of seasons or the return of the olive harvest. You take a breath. Maybe you're not there yet, but you're on your way. You find yourself now seated at a long, sun-warmed stone bench beneath a creeping canopy of grapevines. The air is thick with the scent of fig and rosemary, and somewhere nearby, a small group of philosophers is mid-argument. Well, one is arguing. The others are reclining with an air of seasoned detachment, as if they've already debated this exact topic 100 times before breakfast. This is a symposium, not a frat party, despite the wine. In ancient Greece, the symposium was the intellectual salon of its time, part dinner party, part philosophical battlefield, and entirely dominated by men whose brows were furrowed by both thought and age. The guest list often skewed 50 and up. Youths were there to serve wine, and occasionally to be lovingly roasted. The conversation turns toward irate virtue or excellence. One man with a silvery beard and a voice like dry gravel says, "You cannot even know what virtue is until your desires have quieted." He raises a finger. Until you've lived long enough to watch your most treasured opinions betray you. And there it is again, that uniquely Greek reverence for the slow simmer of time. To them, character was not a fixed trait, but a craft honed across decades, forged in the kiln of embarrassment, regret, and eventually, humility. By 50, you were finally seen as capable of wrestling with life's bigger truths, not because you had all the answers, but because you'd seen enough to stop pretending you did. Even Aristotle, who was no slouch when it came to youthful intellect, suggested that moral virtue required not just reasoning but practice over time through action. A young man might know what is good, sure, but could he become good without having repeatedly chosen it through decades of temptation and failure? You swirl your imaginary wine and notice the symposium's youngest member, the philosopher's apprentice. He's scribbling notes furiously. Occasionally, he glances up with hopeful eyes, searching for the nod of approval from the gray-haired men. It never comes when he expects it, only when he stops asking for it. Meanwhile, an older man, perhaps in his 60s, is telling a story about losing a great fortune and learning, painfully, that happiness isn't found in wealth, but in stillness. He uses the phrase, "after my third bankruptcy," and everyone chuckles, not out of mockery but solidarity. They've all been there, maybe not in coin but in collapse. This blend of confession and comedy was common in Greek philosophical circles. Growing older wasn't just permitted, it was flaunted. Wrinkles were wisdom lines. A bad back meant a front-row seat to existential insight. And at the symposium, one's age didn't diminish their voice, it amplified it. You lean back, letting the wine blur into the background as the conversation shifts again, this time to politics. The young man seeks justice. Someone says, but the old man knows it is rare. There's no cynicism in the voice, only recognition. You can hear the years in his tone, like layers of papyrus being read aloud. Historians still argue whether the symposium was a truly democratic space of thought or just another boys' club, elitist, exclusionary, and powered by privilege. But even skeptics agree. These gatherings were cultural nodes for deep, intergenerational learning, where old age wasn't tucked away, but placed at the head of the table, wine in hand, eyes half closed, but memory sharp as a javelin. As the sun dips lower and shadows stretch across the tiles, you notice something beautiful and slightly absurd. One elder dozing off mid-debate, head cocked at an awkward angle, mouth slightly open, like a wise pelican. No one nudges him awake. Why would they? He's earned the nap. Wisdom doesn't punch a time card. You let your gaze wander to the perimeter, where a few apprentices are leaning in, whispering to one another. They're eager, impatient, occasionally rolling their eyes at the circuitous ramblings of their mentors. But there's respect too, because deep down they know what the Greeks believed. You only understand some things after the fifth heartbreak, the third betrayal, and the second time you lose a sandal in the mud and keep walking anyway. And in this vine-draped courtyard of minds both sharp and softening, you feel something rare. A cultural sanctuary where getting older isn't feared, but celebrated. 50 is not a finish line. It's the real beginning of wisdom, of finally speaking without shouting, of drinking without proving, of knowing when to laugh and when to pause before answering. A breeze rustles through the grape leaves above you. The lyre strikes a gentle note somewhere nearby. And as the stars blink awake in the dusky Athenian sky, you lean your head back and close your eyes. Not in sleep, but in that rare, sacred quiet that only comes when youth stops trying to win. Now you're wandering beneath the flickering torchlight of an Athenian stoa. Those long, columned walkways designed for walking, talking, and looking important while doing both. The marble is cool beneath your feet, and the stone echoes your every step like a quiet round of applause. You're not alone, though. Pacing slowly beside you is a man in a threadbare himation, talking to himself, or rather, to you. His name? Zeno of Citium. Welcome to the dawn of Stoicism, where tranquility is the prize and age is the cost of entry. Zeno's ideas would later ripple through Roman emperors and American motivational speakers, but here, in their seedling stage, they're being whispered to students in long cloaks and tired sandals. Zeno didn't believe in retirement villas or bucket lists. He believed in ataraxia, peace of mind. And guess what? He thought you couldn't truly approach that state until life had thoroughly kicked you in the shins. The Stoic ideal wasn't about suppressing emotions but about understanding them, watching them without being swept away. Like watching clouds from a mountaintop. A mountaintop you only reach by, well, climbing. You remember that guy from the last section, napping in the middle of a heated argument? Classic Stoic energy. Because by the time you're 50, you've probably yelled at a god, fallen in love with someone impractical, and waited in line at the Athenian DMV. And if you're still here, still curious, still open, that's Stoicism in sandals. Zeno believed virtue was the only true good, and virtue required not just time but tempering. You can't teach calm to someone who's never panicked. You can't preach stillness to a toddler hopped up on fig jam. You've got to age into it like wine or a very patient olive tree. This brings us to a lovely little contradiction. The Stoics loved reason, logic, and a certain chilly detachment. But they also loved mentorship, and that meant being deeply involved with people, especially younger people. Zeno himself, cranky as he may have been, attracted a wide range of students, many of them decades younger. They didn't come to him because he was charming. They came because he had been through things, like a boulder that's been smoothed by 100 winters. And that was the paradox of age in Greek thought. You grow distant enough to see clearly, yet close enough to care meaningfully. In youth, you demand answers. At 50, you learn how to live gracefully without them. Here's something quirky for you. The ancient Stoics believed in the logos, a sort of rational order to the universe, kind of like a cosmic spreadsheet. The idea was that if you aligned your soul with this grand equation, you'd find peace. But here's the kicker. Many of them believed that this alignment required age. Not because young people were dumb, but because they were loud. Noisy minds, racing hearts, too much caffeine in the blood, metaphorically speaking. Historians still argue whether Zeno's emphasis on elder wisdom was a clever way to assert control in an age-based hierarchy or a genuine belief in experiential learning. But whether it was strategy or spirituality, the result was the same. The Stoics made space for age not just at the table, but at the head of it. As you walk with Zeno, he suddenly stops, turns to you and says something you'll never forget. Not because it's shocking, but because it's oddly soothing. Imagine everything you've ever lost, he says. And now imagine you never had it. You're free. You blink. Now imagine you never needed it. He adds, with a smile so dry it might be fossilized. That's the kind of emotional Aikido Stoicism trains you for, and it takes a long time to earn that belt, like 50 years, at least, and maybe that's the secret. The Greeks didn't just respect age, they baked it into the philosophical process. They didn't believe you could shortcut wisdom. You had to live, lose, listen, and let go. Not once, dozens of times. Over years that stretch like those long stone stoas, lined with columns of memory and loss and joy and dust. You pause beneath one such column now, running your hand along its weathered groove. You wonder how many others have stood here, at 50 or 60, and felt their youth echo like a footstep behind them, not lost but distant, a previous version of self, waving from the other end of the stoa. The wind picks up slightly, tugging at your himation. Somewhere nearby, another Stoic lecture is beginning. A young student stumbles on a quote and blushes. The elder doesn't scold him. He waits, gives him space to find the thread, because he remembers being that young, and because time measured in years or in pauses is the greatest teacher of all. You keep walking, not toward answers, but toward stillness. That's the Stoic way. And by now, at 50, it's finally starting to feel like yours. You're sitting under the dappled light of a fig tree, somewhere in the Athenian countryside now. The cicadas are chirping like tiny philosophers who never sleep, and in front of you sits a plump, balding man with the twinkle of mischief in his eyes. It's Epicurus. Yes, that Epicurus, the guy everyone thinks was all about orgies and overindulgence, when really he just wanted a peaceful garden, a loaf of bread, and a few good conversations. Epicurus gets a bad rap. Somewhere along the line, Epicurean became a synonym for people who eat foie gras on Tuesdays. But Epicurus wasn't decadent, he was disciplined. His idea of pleasure was more like no drama, lots of figs. His version of the good life wasn't about chasing every thrill. It was about avoiding pain, especially the slow drip kind that comes from a life badly lived. And here's the twist. Epicurus thought you couldn't even begin to understand how to live until you understood how to die, which, for most people, only really starts sinking in somewhere around, say, 50. This is where it gets interesting. For Epicurus, age wasn't a defeat. It was a triumph. Old age was freedom. By then, you'd hopefully stopped obsessing over ambition, over who's got the better toga, or whether your abs could be seen through your chitin. You'd seen the absurdity of striving without end. 50. You were finally ready to enjoy life, not by adding more, but by removing what no longer served you. That doesn't mean Epicurus wanted you to check out and drink fermented goat milk in silence. Quite the opposite. He created the garden, a literal school/community for thinkers who wanted to live simply, wisely, and joyfully. And unlike most other philosophical schools in Athens, Epicurus welcomed everyone. Women, slaves, outsiders. No velvet ropes here. Now here comes your quirky fact. Epicurus believed that the gods existed, but they didn't care about you at all. Imagine divine beings just vibing in their own little realm, totally uninterested in your tax problems or your love life. Kind of comforting, isn't it? Like cosmic permission to stop worrying whether you're being judged by thunderclouds. Historians still debate whether Epicurus was a true atheist in disguise or simply crafting a theology that could calm the average death-anxious Greek citizen. Either way, his message was clear. Don't fear the gods. Don't fear death. Don't even fear aging. Just try not to fear so much. You sip a cup of watered-down wine and glance around the garden. It's not glamorous, but it's serene. The people here are reading scrolls, laughing gently, stretching their aching knees under the olive branches. No one is racing toward greatness. They're easing into contentment. You notice how many of them are gray-haired, sun-spotted, and smiling. These aren't has-beens. These are figured-it-outs. Epicurus turns to you with a soft smile and says, "It is impossible to live the pleasant life without also living wisely, honorably, and justly." Then he passes you a bowl of olives and adds, "Also, maybe don't eat after sundown. It gives me weird dreams." That's the Epicurean approach in a nutshell. Wisdom with a wink. There's something deeply subversive about a philosophy that treats aging not as a tragedy but as a culmination. In youth, you're sold the idea that life's peak is somewhere between 20 and 35. But Epicurus says, wait, be patient. It gets better. You unlearn the nonsense. You start craving quieter victories. You appreciate people more and performances less. Epicurus even wrote a letter to a friend, on his deathbed no less, saying he was in pain but mentally at peace. Why? Because he remembered the conversations they had shared. The laughter, the figs, the quietude. Pain was real, yes, but so was peace. He died the way he lived. Not resisting, not resenting, just releasing. You lean back against the fig tree and feel the warm breeze carry the scent of sage and sun-warmed earth. Someone's humming a melody. Another is reciting a passage from memory. Epicurus himself? He's taken off his sandals and is wriggling his toes in the grass. The man knew how to be alive. So here's what Epicurus offers you, now that you're 50. Not a command, not a warning, but an invitation. An invitation to prune your life like a well-tended garden. To remove what stings and withers. To savor what grows in simplicity. And to realize, finally, joyfully, that you've been carrying your happiness around with you this whole time. You just needed 50 years to stop misplacing it. The sun begins to dip behind the hills. You pull your cloak a little tighter and let yourself breathe, long and slow and without effort. You're not striving. You're not chasing. You're just being. And that, according to Epicurus, is the highest pleasure of all. You're strolling through the white marble colonnades of the Stoa Poikile now, the painted porch, and it's not hard to see how it got its name. Vivid murals splash across the stone, showing battles, legends, and some serious toga drama. But today, you're here for something quieter. This is the home turf of Stoicism. And standing near the far end, with a beard like a philosophical thundercloud, is Zeno of Citium. Zeno doesn't greet you with a smile. He doesn't really do smiles. But he does nod like someone who's already read your diary. He's the guy who founded the Stoic school, not in some high tower or secret temple, but right here, in the open-air heart of the city. Why? Because philosophy, he believed, isn't for libraries, it's for life. Now, if you've heard of Stoicism today, chances are you've picked up on the grit your teeth and don't cry version. But the real Stoics were deeper than that. Less macho, more mindful. Their idea of strength was knowing what you can't control, and then letting it go. Your boss? Your back pain? The weather in Sparta? Not up to you, but your response? Totally your domain. And this is where the magic of aging kicks in. You see, Stoicism requires time. It's not something you pick up in a single scroll reading session. It's something you grow into, like a pair of well-worn sandals. At 20, you say you don't care what people think. At 50, you actually don't. At 20, you try to control outcomes. At 50, you control your outlook. Big difference. Zeno's spiritual descendants, Epictetus, Seneca, and eventually Emperor Marcus Aurelius, took this idea and ran with it. All of them believed old age wasn't a decline but an upgrade. Because only through age do you finally learn how to say, with your whole chest, I do not need to win, I just need to be aligned with virtue. Quirky fact time. Zeno died by holding his breath. No dramatic poison or sword. Just a calm exit from a body he felt had served its time. Try that the next time your dentist says, this might pinch. Historians still argue whether the Stoics were overly cold or refreshingly realistic. Was their ideal of apatheia, freedom from emotional disturbance, healthy detachment, or spiritual numbing? But for many Greeks, especially as they aged, Stoicism offered relief from the noise of existence. Not silence, but signal. At 50, Stoicism starts to land differently. You've had enough loss by now. You've buried a dream or two, maybe even a person or two. You've tasted ambition, heartbreak, illness, boredom. You've seen what happens when you fight too hard for things that don't matter. The Stoics don't tell you to stop caring. They just remind you to care wisely. Marcus Aurelius, writing in his twilight years, put it best. You could leave life right now. Let that determine what you do and say and think. It's not a morbid thought, it's a focusing one. Like putting a gentle frame around your day. No more waiting for someday. 50 is today. So act like it. You follow a group of Stoic students through the painted porch. They're debating whether virtue is sufficient for happiness, or if external goods matter too. One of them drops his papyrus scroll. No one panics. No one shouts. Someone chuckles and says, a good test of character. Then they all nod and continue. You kind of love them for that. One elderly woman, yes, Stoics weren't just men, leans over to you and says, it took me 60 years to stop trying to control the wind. Now I just adjust the sail. And she means it. You can tell. Her eyes don't dart. Her breath is steady. She's not rushing to the next thing. She's already here. You notice something else too. Stoics aren't unfeeling, they're unflappable. Which, at 50, feels more useful than being unstoppable. Who wants to sprint forever? What you need now is endurance, clarity, grace under pressure, and maybe a few deep sighs followed by knowing glances. By now, the sun is angling low, casting long shadows across the porch. The marble glows faintly gold. You sit down on one of the stone benches and breathe in the quiet. You're not here to perform. You're not here to prove. You're here to practice. The Stoics never promised you'd be happy every day. They just promised you'd be free. And isn't that what aging is really about? Shedding what weighs you down. Walking a little lighter, a little wiser. Laughing when the scroll falls. Choosing peace over panic. And maybe, just maybe, learning how to hold your breath, not to escape but to release. You blink and the sun has slid behind the columns. The painted porch is quiet now, except for the soft creak of leather sandals and the occasional flutter of a pigeon wing. But you're not alone. Across the agora, another figure is waiting. A bearded man in a battered cloak who looks like he might insult you just for fun. That's Diogenes. If Zeno taught you how to let go, Diogenes teaches you how to dropkick societal norms off a cliff. You walk toward him cautiously because honestly you've heard the stories. The man once lived in a barrel, told Alexander the Great to move because he was blocking his sunlight, and is rumored to have publicly done things best left unmentioned. Let's just say Diogenes wasn't big on boundaries. But he was big on one thing, freedom. Radical, almost reckless, unshackled from approval freedom. And age? Oh, Diogenes wore his aging like armor. He didn't try to hide his wrinkles, he pointed to them and laughed. To him, getting old wasn't a loss. It was a rebellion. A chance to finally stop pretending to be civilized and just be real. You're not sure you're ready for that level of raw, but something about his energy feels honest. At 50, you start craving that kind of truth. Not the polished, polite kind, but the bite-sized, brutal kind that says, you don't need another degree, you need to stop lying to yourself. Quirky aside. Diogenes once walked around Athens in broad daylight holding a lantern, claiming to be looking for an honest man. If he passed you now, would he keep walking? Historians still argue whether Diogenes was a philosophical genius or just a highly articulate troll. Was he deep or just disruptive? But either way, his legacy endures. He taught through provocation, and his message was clear. If you want to be truly free, you have to stop caring what other people think, even if they think you're nuts. 50 is the perfect age to start doing that. You've got enough experience to recognize empty praise. Enough heartbreak to spot emotional manipulation. Enough tired mornings to know that self-worth built on social media likes is a house of cards in a thunderstorm. Diogenes didn't seek admiration, he rejected it. He once threw away a perfectly good cup because he saw a boy drinking water from his hands. Aha! He cried. A child has beaten me in simplicity. Try turning that into a TED Talk. He reminds you of your weirdest uncle, the one who lives off the grid, eats dandelions, and swears the government is watching his goats. But he also reminds you of your own buried instincts, the ones that used to ask, why are we doing this again? Before adulthood taught you to stop asking. At 50, those questions return. Louder, sharper. You start wondering why you still say yes to things that drain you. Why you bought clothes that itch. Why you keep pretending you like quinoa. Diogenes would say, stop pretending. Stop polishing. Stop performing. Just be. You sit beside him, not sure whether to speak or just mimic his shrug. He scratches his beard and mutters something about how the gods must laugh at humans trying to build careers. We're just clever animals, he says, building pyramids out of paper. That lands harder than you expect. He points to a group of young Athenians arguing about wealth and success. Look at them, he says. They think youth gives them power. But it's only in age that you realize how little you need to feel complete. You ask him what makes life worth living, half expecting a sarcastic grunt. Instead, he says, a nap, figure a good joke, a day without pretending, and maybe a sunset that doesn't ask you to take a picture of it. You stare at the horizon with him, both silent for a long moment. Diogenes may not have written treatises or built schools, but his version of philosophy still floats on the wind. And at 50, you can hear it more clearly. You've peeled away enough falsehoods to crave the raw material of truth, even if it smells a little like barrel wood and defiance. There's something freeing about standing in the dust with nothing to prove. You've built your resume, sure. You've played the game. But maybe now's the time to play something simpler. To hold your own lantern up and search. Not for success, but for honesty. The kind that doesn't need applause. As you stand to leave, Diogenes grunts and tosses you a half-eaten figure. You'll do, he says with what might be affection, or indigestion, hard to tell. But something in your shoulders relaxes. Something in your heart lets go. You're not trying to impress the philosophers anymore. You're just trying to join them. You dust fig bits from your tunic and leave Diogenes behind, his barrel retreating into the golden haze. The agora is quieter now, shadows stretching long and thin like parchment laid out to dry. Your steps take you away from the public squares and towards something more hidden, more private. The winding paths of the Lyceum, where another philosopher waits, Aristotle. Unlike the wild, lantern-waving chaos of Diogenes, Aristotle is pure order. He maps thoughts the way city planners map streets. Everything has a category, a hierarchy, a function. And he has so many categories. Plants, emotions, types of government, friends. He even tries to classify the soul, as if it were a rare bird he could sketch from every angle. When you arrive at the Lyceum, students are pacing the gravel paths. They call them peripatetics, walkers who learn with their feet. It suits your 50-year-old joints. Sitting too long now feels like betrayal. So you walk. You listen. Aristotle doesn't waste time. What is the good life? He asks. And because you're older now, you don't flinch at the question. You nod because that's exactly what you came to ask him. He launches into eudaimonia, a word that makes your tongue stumble but your heart lean in. It means human flourishing, not pleasure, not wealth, not fame, but the quiet, satisfying hum of a life lived in balance, purpose, and virtue. You're surprised by how practical it all feels. For a philosopher, Aristotle is shockingly down to earth. He doesn't want you to become a monk or reject society. He wants you to participate well, think clearly, act with integrity, be the kind of person your dog thinks you are. He believes the golden age of a human life is not childhood or youth. It's not the hustle years or the party phase. It's the period when you've grown enough to know better and calm enough to do better. Guess when that usually happens? Yeah. Around 50. Aristotle would call this your time of phronesis, practical wisdom. You've messed up enough to learn. You've succeeded enough to teach. And most importantly, you've lost enough to recognize what really matters. Mainstream fact: Aristotle tutored Alexander the Great. Yes, that Alexander, conqueror of half the known world. Which means at some point, the most powerful man in the world was still just a teenager being told to stop interrupting his philosophy tutor. Quirky tidbit: Aristotle dissected sea creatures obsessively and was kind of obsessed with eels. He believed everything had a purpose, even eels, even you. Especially now, when your value isn't about ambition, but contribution. Historians still debate whether Aristotle truly believed in equality, or whether his writings just reflect his social context. He justified some things that would make a modern ethics professor wince. But still, his vision of human flourishing, rooted in action, virtue, and thought, endures. And it hits different at 50. Because suddenly, you're no longer driven by the adrenaline of proving yourself. You're looking at the map Aristotle drew and realizing you don't want to reach every destination, just the meaningful ones. The ones where your time and effort bloom into something lasting. He believed that your soul has a shape, and your job is to live into that shape fully. Like acorns are meant to become oaks, and humans are meant to become themselves, only more refined. You wonder what your soul's shape is. You wonder if you've let it take form, or if you've spent decades contorting it to fit someone else's expectations. This is the part where Aristotle would hand you a mirror, gently, not to check for crow's feet, but to ask, are you growing into your purpose, or away from it? The walking slows. The sun has begun to dip low behind the Lyceum's trees, and the students murmur their goodbyes. Aristotle nods at you once, and that's it. Lesson over. No big speech, just a sense that the day, like a well-balanced sentence, has come to its period. You're left pacing the path a little longer, reflecting on your own eudaimonia. You think about how much time you've wasted chasing applause, how many nights you've given to worry and comparison and pretending to enjoy networking events. And you think about what it would mean to spend the next part of your life rooted in the slow growth of something better. Aristotle would tell you, that's not just aging. That's wisdom. You glance up. The sky is softening into lavender. A breeze moves through the olive trees like a sigh. And for a moment, you feel the distinct, almost embarrassing sensation that your 50-year-old self might actually be closer to whole than your 20-year-old self ever was. Not faster, not richer, but wiser. You smile. You walk. You don't even mind the gravel in your sandals. You leave the Lyceum with your head spinning a little, in a good way. Aristotle's voice still echoes somewhere in your chest like the chime of a well-struck bell. But tonight's philosophical walk isn't done yet. Not by a long shot, because now we're heading to the theater. Not for popcorn and previews, though that sounds dreamy. No, we're talking about the Theater of Dionysus, carved into the southern slope of the Acropolis in Athens. Stone seats, open sky, and a stage where playwrights once laid bare the guts of human nature in front of thousands. You sit down on one of the time-smoothed steps, legs stretched out like you're waiting for a play to start. And in a way, you are, because it's time to talk about tragedy. Not just theatrical tragedy, but the kind that Greek thinkers saw as essential to a full human life. This is where Sophocles enters like a perfectly timed entrance in Act 1. When he wrote Oedipus Rex, he wasn't just trying to make audiences gasp. He was handing them a mirror, a slightly cracked one. Because in that story, the one where a man tries to escape fate and ends up tumbling right into it, there's something unsettlingly universal. Something a 50-year-old understands better than a 20-year-old ever could. The Greeks believed that true wisdom comes from suffering, that clarity often arrives through loss, pain, or gut-wrenching humiliation. Basically, your worst moments are doing more for your soul than your highlight reel ever could. Mainstream fact: Sophocles himself lived to about 90, an age that back then was practically mythic. And he wrote some of his best, most emotionally complex plays after 50. Which means, if you haven't hit your storytelling prime yet, you're in excellent company. Quirky tidbit: ancient audiences came to the theater not just to be entertained, but to purge emotions. This was called catharsis. Imagine crying so hard at a play you feel spiritually exfoliated. Now imagine society encouraging you to do this on purpose, with your neighbors, as civic duty. Historians still argue whether Sophocles intended his tragedies as moral lessons, emotional therapy, or political commentary, but most agree they were powerful enough to do all three. And you sit there, 50 years old, and suddenly feel like Greek tragedy was written for you, because you've loved people who've left. You've made choices that didn't pan out. You've stood at forks in the road and picked the one you thought was paved, only to discover it was mostly potholes and existential dread. But through all of it, you've become more. Not necessarily better or happier or richer, just more, as in more layered, more aware, more grounded in the strange gravity of being alive. The Greeks didn't idealize youth. They saw it as the prelude, not the masterpiece. The real beauty began when the edges started to fray, when your character, like theirs, was tested by the script of life. You shift on the stone bench. Your knees creak a little. And you remember how, in Greek theater, the chorus would often serve as the voice of the public, commenting, reacting, warning. You wonder what your personal chorus would say right now. Maybe, "You've endured, you've wept, you've laughed inappropriately at funerals and stared too long at your ceiling fan. And yet, here you are. You smile. A few seats down, you imagine Euripides leaning on his elbow, eyeing you like a cat with a secret. He'd write about women too wise for their time, about gods behaving badly, about mortals stuck in impossible binds. He'd whisper, "There's power in the aftermath. In the what now?" You nod, because you've lived enough to know that healing doesn't always arrive with trumpets. Sometimes, it tiptoes in with a cup of tea and a terrible pun. Which reminds you, comedies were just as important as tragedies. Aristophanes, that irreverent genius, wrote plays that mocked everything. War, politics, philosophers, even the gods. He'd be the one texting you memes after your divorce. Because while tragedy cuts deep, comedy stitches the soul back together with sloppy, loving hands. And you need both. Because the Greeks weren't trying to choose between light and dark. They knew the dance needed both. 50 is when you stop expecting one without the other. You accept that grief can follow joy like a curious puppy, and sometimes joy returns the favor. The theater dims. Not because a curtain falls, there is no curtain, but because night has arrived, slipping in with velvet feet. You rise. You've absorbed your catharsis, and you walk out not cleansed, not reborn, but acknowledged. The tragedies you've lived haven't broken you. They've given your life its architecture. Just as the columns around this sacred hill have survived earthquakes, fires, and tourists, so too have you. You take a last look at the stone seats, empty now, but echoing with centuries of laughter and sobbing. You feel strangely honored to be part of that audience, that ancient, aching, hopeful crowd. And now, you descend the hill slowly, like the end of a good play, not eager for the next act, but grateful for the one you've lived. You descend from the theater, your steps lighter, your chest looser, as though you've unbuttoned some emotional collar you didn't know you'd been wearing. The moon hangs above like a silent spectator, nodding gently as if to say, yes, you're exactly where you need to be. Now let's wander a little, somewhere quieter, somewhere less public. Tonight, you're invited into the ancient Greek mind, not the kind scribbled in dusty scrolls, but the kind scribbled in your own aging neurons. Because now we're going to talk about the Stoics. And no, they're not just a bunch of buzzkills who tell you not to feel things. They're more like ancient therapists who charge in drachmas and speak in paradoxes. The first stop, the painted porch in Athens. The Stoa Poikile. This is where Zeno of Citium taught philosophy, not in ivory towers, but in open-air colonnades where people sold figs one stall over. Zeno wasn't born in Athens. He showed up after surviving a shipwreck. Yes, a literal shipwreck. He lost everything. Clothes, cargo, probably a really nice sandal. And instead of crying into a broken amphora, he wandered into a bookshop and started reading Socrates. That was his plot twist. And it's kind of a Stoic thing to do, because if you're 50, you've had your own shipwrecks. Maybe not nautical, but just as wet and embarrassing. Relationships that sank. Careers that veered into iceberg territory. Dreams that sprouted leaks. But the Stoics say, that's where philosophy begins. Mainstream fact, Stoicism isn't about suppressing emotion. It's about seeing clearly. Epictetus, a former slave turned philosopher, taught that we cannot control events, only our responses to them. Clean, simple, infuriatingly wise. Quirky tidbit. Some Stoics practiced premeditatio malorum, mentally rehearsing worst-case scenarios every morning. Not because they were pessimists, but because they believed that if you imagined losing everything, you'd stop being so afraid of living. So, each day, they'd wake up and think, what if my house burns down? What if I get sick? What if I die today? Then they'd go about their day strangely liberated. Historians still argue whether Stoicism was a philosophy of elite detachment or deep emotional resilience. But what's clear is this: Stoicism thrives in middle age. Because when you're young, you think control is the goal. You cling to things, status, people, plans. But at 50, you start to see the cracks. The beautiful, terrifying cracks. And the Stoics meet you there with a shrug and a smile. Yes, it's all unstable, they say. But isn't that kind of freeing? You sit beneath a fig tree, legs outstretched, back against stone. Maybe a cicada buzzes somewhere. Maybe not. But in your head, a stillness begins to form. You think of Marcus Aurelius, Roman emperor and part-time journaler of eternal truths. His meditations weren't meant for you or anyone really. They were notes to himself written during plague and war. And yet, across time and empires, they whisper to you now. Waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be. Be one. Simple, brutal, gentle. You think about how many times you've waited. For a better mood. For clarity. For someone to forgive you first. For life to hand you a sign. The Stoics call that wasted motion. At 50, you begin to learn the art of letting be. Not giving up. Not giving in. Just choosing not to wrestle every river into a straight line. You've earned this surrender. The kind that isn't about defeat, but about wisdom. You've tried fighting life. You've tried outsmarting it. Now you try flowing with it. And suddenly, this moment, this quiet moonlit pause under a fig tree in your mind, feels like everything Stoicism has been pointing toward. You think about someone you've lost. The grief that still presses against your ribs sometimes when you least expect it. And the Stoics would say you were lucky to have loved at all. That nothing truly beautiful can ever be possessed. Only witnessed. Only remembered. And just like that, the ache feels lighter. Not gone, but softened. You open your eyes, whether metaphorically or literally is up to you. Maybe you stand and brush imaginary dust from your pants. Maybe you sigh the kind of sigh that feels like forgiveness. For yourself. For the past. For that one time you yelled at a barista because your coffee was too hot. You were going through something. It's okay. As you walk away from the Stoic porch, a phrase sticks with you like fig sap on your fingers. You are not disturbed by things, but by your opinion of things. You turn that over in your mind like a coin in your pocket. You're not disturbed by turning 50. You're disturbed by what you think 50 means. But what if it meant this? Quiet strength, earned perspective, the ability to sit with pain without fleeing, to sit with joy without clinging, to sit with yourself without needing noise. You walk on.
No fanfare. No epiphany ni montage.
Just a slow, steady beat of breath, like the kind you fall asleep to, like the kind that tells you you're here, still walking. You keep walking, footsteps soft on cobblestone streets that seem to stretch both forward and backward in time, blurring the line between past and present. The evening air is cool now, with a faint hint of jasmine drifting in from a nearby garden. This is not just a stroll. It's a passage through the unfolding story of human life and how we've learned to think about aging, especially when that fateful number 50 arrives. Remember Herodotus? The father of history once said, 50 years is a good long life. But that's not just a throwaway line. It's a reflection of ancient realities. In a world without modern medicine, making it to 50 meant you'd beaten the odds. You'd seen the harshness of the world, the ebb and flow of fortune, and you'd come through with scars and wisdom. Fast forward to the philosopher Socrates, who famously claimed, "The unexamined life is not worth living." By the time you're 50, the unexamined life starts to feel like a missed opportunity. Book half read. You've got chapters behind you, but the ending is still unwritten. And this is the juicy paradox the Greeks loved. Your prime isn't in youth when the body is at its peak, but in the middle of life, when the mind and soul have grown roots. Here's a quirky tidbit for you. Some Greek philosophers believed the brain matured around 50. Crazy, right? While modern neuroscience laughs softly at that. It's a poetic way to acknowledge that real mental mastery, the kind that blends experience with reflection, happens later than we might expect. So next time you forget where you left your keys, just think of yourself as a mental apprentice working toward mastery. Historians still argue whether this emphasis on middle age was a way for older generations to justify their authority or a genuine celebration of mature wisdom. Maybe a bit of both. But the takeaway? Age 50 was seen as a milestone for the flourishing of reason, virtue, and calmness. The sweet spot where the restless heat of youth cools into steady fire. In the hustle culture of today, that might sound like a lull, a slowdown nobody asks for. But in the quiet corners of ancient philosophy, it's a release. The moment when you stop sprinting and start walking with purpose. And that purpose is not about collecting things or chasing applause. It's about understanding the small, overlooked moments, the taste of morning coffee, the texture of a well-worn chair, the way shadows stretch as the sun dips low. As you walk deeper into this philosophical garden, you notice the subtle scent of oregano, earthy and familiar. The Greeks believed in phronesis or practical wisdom, the ability to make good choices based on experience. By 50, phronesis was your reward, the fruit of years spent learning when to speak and when to listen, when to act and when to wait. You might chuckle thinking, I still don't know when to do those things perfectly, but that's part of the charm. The Greeks never expected perfection, only progress. They believed that living well was a practice, like tending a garden or playing an instrument, and 50 was the age when you finally knew enough to stop pulling weeds at random. That's when the real growth begins. Now, picture yourself sitting on a stone bench in a sunlit agora. Around you, conversations hum, some loud, some quiet. A stranger mentions the Greek goddess Athena, goddess of wisdom and strategy, and you think, yeah, this is the vibe. Athena wasn't just about raw intelligence. She embodied calm, thoughtful action, exactly the traits celebrated at midlife. The Greeks believed that reaching 50 was like stepping into Athena's shoes, ready to navigate life's battles with skill and composure, rather than brute force. Mainstream fact: Aristotle, the student of Plato and tutor to Alexander the Great, famously wrote about the stages of life, suggesting that between 40 and 60 was the period of maturity where judgment and virtue peak. Quirky tidbit: Aristotle also suggested that the senses start dulling around 50, making people less distracted by flashy things and more attuned to inner beauty. So, If you find yourself appreciating silence or the smell of rain more than before, you're just living the Aristotelian dream. Historians still debate how much these ideas about midlife influenced actual social roles in ancient Greece. Was 50 truly a golden age, or a philosophical ideal disconnected from harsh realities like disease and war? Regardless, you feel the weight and lightness of these thoughts settling in, like a soft blanket wrapped around your shoulders on a cool evening. You stand, ready to keep moving. The night is deepening now, and your journey through the timeless wisdom of the ages has only just begun. You move forward now with a quiet awareness, as though each step taps into something deeper than mere history, a kind of resonance that comes only with time. The ancient stone path beneath your feet seems almost designed to slow your pace, to ask you not to rush through this next idea. Because tonight, you're entering the realm of Greek mystery cults, and how they, too, revered the wisdom of age. The Eleusinian mysteries were perhaps the most famous of these secretive rites. Rooted in the myth of Demeter and Persephone, they promised initiates a glimpse of life's deeper meaning, and maybe even a good afterlife, if they played their philosophical cards right. Participation wasn't limited by wealth or rank, but age? Age mattered. You needed to be old enough to understand metaphor, loss, sacrifice, and often that meant midlife and beyond. In fact, you can imagine yourself standing before the telesterion, the grand hall of initiation. A soft breeze carries the scent of olive wood smoke. It's night. You're handed a torch, and for once, you don't feel the urge to ask what happens next. Because by this age, you know that some things must be experienced slowly, even in silence. Mainstream fact: the Eleusinian mysteries were held annually for over 1,000 years, and were considered the pinnacle of spiritual experience in ancient Greece. So sacred that even the Romans, those famously pragmatic empire builders, held them in awe. Here's a fringe tidbit to chew on. Some historians believe initiates may have consumed a psychoactive potion called kykeon, a barley-based drink possibly laced with ergot, the same fungus that inspired LSD. Imagine that you're 50, sipping ancient mind-altering tea, and contemplating the afterlife. One heck of a birthday celebration, but scholars still debate what was actually revealed during the Eleusinian rituals. The secrecy was airtight. Even under threat of death, no initiate spilled the beans. That's made historians squirm for centuries, scratching their heads and publishing speculative papers about what might have gone down behind those thick temple walls. And yet, that secrecy makes sense in the context of Greek aging. 50. Your relationship with truth changes. You stop looking for answers you can shout across a room. You start honoring the kind that live in pauses, glances, and dreams that refuse to be pinned down. It's this very shift, from loud certainty to quiet knowing, that the Greeks saw as sacred. It's not that you suddenly become mystical or foggy-eyed. It's more like the edges of things blur in a pleasant way. You start to understand that paradox isn't confusion, it's a deeper kind of order. You chuckle now, remembering how much energy you used to spend proving your point. But here, in the soft hush of philosophical twilight, you see the wisdom of a shrug, a nod, and the classic Greek phrase, perhaps. And the Greeks were masters of perhaps. They didn't need every story to end in certainty, especially not the stories that mattered, like what happens after we die, or how we should measure a life well lived. That's why midlife became a canvas for philosophy. You had enough years behind you to see patterns, enough years ahead to still care. You think back to Plato's Phaedo, where Socrates drinks the hemlock. His calm acceptance of death wasn't just stoicism. It was a product of a life spent preparing, thinking, questioning. He was around 70, but in the ancient Greek mind, it was in his 50s that this peace began to crystallize. There's something poetic in that, like the way olives don't even begin to bear fruit until they're several decades old, or how marble only gains its patina after being weathered by wind, rain, and sun. Beauty, according to the Greeks, was not youth, it was endurance refined by reflection. You pass a grove of fig trees. Somewhere in the distance, an owl calls. Athena's bird, of course. You smile. That quiet hoot sounds more like a whisper now. Not advice exactly, just company. Mainstream thinkers might point to Greece's warrior culture and say, wait, weren't men expected to be battlefield-ready well before 50? And yes, that's true. But even Achilles and Odysseus had their moments of existential crisis, usually in their later years. Odysseus returns home not as a conquering hero, but as a man longing for peace, family, and rest. Fringe insight. Some Greek city-states had age-based councils, like Sparta's Gerousia, which literally means Council of Elders. To join, you had to be over 60, but most members were revered already in their 50s for their judgment. You weren't dismissed for growing older, you were finally taken seriously. Historians still argue whether these institutions were truly democratic or just cleverly disguised oligarchies. But even if the politics were messy, the symbolism stuck. Elders were guides, not leftovers. So as you walk further through this philosophical dusk, with the moon casting silver light across ancient stones, you realize something quietly profound. Maybe the Greeks weren't trying to glorify aging. Maybe they were just making peace with it, giving it a language, a shape, and even a touch of ceremony. After all, life's second act isn't about retreating. It's about entering the sacred halls of your own experience and beginning to share its subtle, glimmering truths. The path continues, and you walk it now with quieter feet, not because you're tired, but because reverence has replaced urgency. Around you, the stone columns grow taller, less like ruins and more like memory made solid. You're drifting toward a place where time feels optional, where Greek philosophers didn't just write but waited. And in this next stretch of the journey, you sit beside a man with a long beard and longer pauses. His name? Heraclitus. The guy who said, "You can't step into the same river twice." Very poetic, very confusing, and very Greek. Heraclitus wasn't much for social gatherings. He preferred silence and streams. He saw change as the only constant, and believed wisdom came not from collecting facts, but from contemplating how everything flows, especially your own mind. And for that, he argued age helped. Mainstream fact, Heraclitus was known as the obscure, and even in his own time, people found him mystifying. But he was widely respected for believing that true understanding didn't come in youth's rush but in age's stillness. That kind of thinking doesn't appeal to a 20-year-old. It barely appeals to a 30-year-old. But by 50, it starts to make deep, almost bone-level sense. You begin to see why Greek thinkers insisted that philosophy required aging. When you're younger, you study philosophy like it's a subject. But in later life, philosophy becomes a place you live. Its questions become furniture, its contradictions your favorite chair. Even the layout of Greek philosophical schools reflected this slow-burn transformation. The Stoics gathered in the Stoa, an open colonnade, not just for lectures, but for walking meditations. You can picture yourself strolling under that shaded arcade, letting thoughts roll around in your head like smooth pebbles, not forcing conclusions, just noticing how your breath matches the stone rhythm beneath your feet. Fringe tidbit. There's a theory that Greek philosophers timed their writing and teaching for seasonal moods. Spring was for debate, summer for retreat, autumn for introspection, and winter for writing. So, if you're reading this in October, congratulations. You're right on schedule for a reflective stroll through existentialism. And speaking of the Stoics, let's revisit Epictetus. A slave turned sage. He didn't even begin to teach until he was free, and already middle-aged. He believed we don't control what happens, only how we respond. And while that sounds simple, the practice takes decades to sink in. At 50, you've seen enough loss, change, and chaos to start internalizing it. Not perfectly, but sincerely. Historians still argue whether the Stoics encouraged apathy or active peace. Some say they were disengaged. Others that they were simply choosing where to invest their precious energy. Either way, their ideas resonate more with people who felt life wear them in all the right places. You brush your hand along a rough marble wall. It's warm from the day's heat, but cooling, just like you. A little worn, but radiant in a way that doesn't need to shout. And there's another voice waiting for you. Democritus, the laughing philosopher. Unlike Heraclitus, Democritus believed life should be met with joy, even in hardship. He argued that the soul grows lighter with time, not heavier, that the body may slow, but the spirit gains buoyancy. You can almost hear his chuckle echo through the olive groves. Of course, Democritus also believed that everything was made of tiny atoms moving through the void, which, for a guy from the 5th century BCE, was pretty wild. And while we now have physics to confirm some of his ideas, his greater insight may have been emotional. That a life broken into small, joyful particles can feel fuller, longer. You sit under a fig tree, the same kind Plato probably sat beneath when he wrote the Republic. Not the exact tree, of course, but maybe a descendant. You like the symmetry. Mainstream fact. In Plato's famous allegory of the cave, the moment of enlightenment comes when the prisoner escapes the shadows and sees the sun for the first time. But here's the kicker. Plato suggests most people never reach that point until midlife. You can't force it. You have to earn it through slow exposure to difficult truths. And if that's not a metaphor for turning 50, nothing is. Scholars debate what the cave really represents: politics, education, or maybe even the aging process itself. But whatever it is, it doesn't rush. Just like you now. You're not climbing toward the light. You're easing into it one cautious footstep at a time. Fringe insight. Some fringe academics claim that Plato's death at age 80 was hastened not by age, but by an awkward dinner party injury. That may not be true, but the fact that people tell the story reminds you how even the wise die clumsily, which is strangely comforting, because despite all the grand ideas, the meticulous logic, and the epic metaphors, Greek philosophers were just people. And in their later years, they weren't aiming to be brilliant anymore. They were just trying to be at peace with their bodies, with time, with the fact that most of life is not a clean equation, but a smudged sketch you keep adjusting. And you, now entering that golden corridor of your own life, start to see the appeal of this imperfect wisdom. Not loud, not final, but true in a way that feels like rest. You close your eyes. The breeze shifts. The scent of cypress and worn parchment rises faintly in the air. You smile. You're not just learning history. You're becoming it. You don't know exactly when the agora emptied out behind you. Maybe it was sometime after Plato's allegories, or during that long pause under the fig tree. Either way, you're alone now. Or rather, you're in the kind of solitude that isn't lonely, just earned. The kind that feels like a warm shawl draped over your shoulders after a long journey. You stroll through an old stone path now, the kind polished by 1,000 years of footsteps. You feel them in the soles of your own, sandal or sneaker, doesn't matter. You're walking alongside shadows of those who came before, including one last philosopher we haven't really visited yet. An oddball, a rebel, a man who made old age into performance art. Meet Diogenes. Mainstream historical fact. Diogenes of Sinope lived in a literal barrel. Yes, an actual clay storage jar. He believed society was corrupt, comfort was dangerous, and truth could only be found by stripping life down to its bare essentials. He had no patience for polite society or hypocrisy, and zero interest in being taken seriously in his youth. But in his older years, that's when he really flourished. Picture it. A man with a long beard, no shoes, no property, no official job title, just wandering around Athens in broad daylight with a lantern. When asked what he was doing, he'd say, "Looking for an honest man." Cheeky? Yes. But underneath the satire was something raw. The idea that maybe, just maybe, you have to unlearn a lot of what you spent your early years chasing. Titles, status, pleasing other people. By the time you're 50, Diogenes would argue, you've had enough of that nonsense. You can't help but laugh a little, imagining him heckling Plato in public, calling his academy a waste of time. Diogenes famously interrupted one of Plato's lectures by plucking a chicken and saying, "Behold, a man," mocking Plato's overly abstract definitions. Fringe tidbit. Some stories claim Alexander the Great visited Diogenes and asked if he could do anything for him. Diogenes allegedly replied, "Yes, step out of my sunlight." Whether it's true or not, it's one of the boldest, most delightfully grumpy moments in ancient history, and proof that aging can actually be empowering, not diminishing. And yet, Diogenes wasn't just a provocateur. In his own way, he modeled a philosophy of aging that wasn't about retreating from life, but reprioritizing it. Cutting the fluff, leaving only the stuff that actually matters. Historians still argue whether Diogenes was serious or just playing a long-running joke on Western civilization. But isn't that the point? Maybe by 50, you've earned the right to be taken seriously and not care if you are. And this wasn't just about philosophy. It ran through every fiber of Greek culture. Age wasn't an inconvenience. It was an asset. You weren't still alive. You were finally useful. Even the theater, that mirror of society, reflected this reverence. Greek tragedies often featured older characters as voices of reason, figures who had seen enough to speak calmly when everyone else panicked. And comedies? Oh, the old men in those plays were wily, cunning, hilarious, because age, to the Greeks, wasn't a fall from glory. It was the rise of something deeper. Mainstream fact: in Athens, older citizens were entrusted with overseeing certain legal cases and religious rituals. There was an understanding that time sharpened judgment, not dulled it. And while not every elder was wise, they were expected to be. That expectation mattered. It gave you something to grow into. You feel that as you wander deeper through the colonnades. Maybe you're not Diogenes. You like indoor plumbing too much, but his ghost trails behind you, chuckling. You pass a quiet fountain now, the water trickling in rhythmic laps. A reminder: life doesn't rush. It ripples. You've stopped trying to sprint toward meaning. You let it come to you. And there's one last insight here, a quieter one. Not shouted from a soapbox, or etched in marble, but murmured in passing by a Greek poet whose name is mostly forgotten. Fringe tidbit. There's an anonymous fragment, preserved on a shard of pottery, that simply reads, "The heart does not fully open until the bones begin to close." No one knows who wrote it. No one knows if it was meant to be sad or sacred, but it sticks with you, because that's what all these Greeks were pointing toward, in their scrolls and sandals and debates under the sun. That something happens, not at 25, not at 35, but in that strange, golden middle where memory deepens and ambition softens. You no longer measure your life by how far you've come or how much you've gathered. You begin to measure it by how clearly you can see, how gently you can speak, and how gracefully you can let things go. Even your shadow feels softer now, more like silk than stone. You've walked through reason, rebellion, doubt, and laughter. You've spent time with the thinkers who laid the intellectual groundwork for all of Western civilization. And none of them believed youth had the final word. Instead, they waited for the hush, for the exhale, for the part of life you're entering now. Not a decline, but an arrival. The kind of arrival that doesn't need to announce itself. It simply walks in, nods quietly, and sits beside you. Now, in this final leg of your twilight stroll through ancient Greece, you find yourself beneath a massive olive tree. Its roots twisted like slow thoughts, its leaves whispering secrets only age can understand. You've seen this tree before, or maybe not this exact one, but 1,000 like it, in amphora paintings, on coins, etched into temples. The olive was more than a crop. It was a symbol. Of peace, yes, but also patience, growth, deep time. You look up at its gnarled branches and realize you're staring at the Greek symbol for longevity itself. Because here's the thing the philosophers never said outright but always meant. The golden years weren't after the action. They were the action. The real theater, the real drama, happens when the noise dies down and the soul leans in. Let's talk about Solon now. He was Athens' lawmaker, statesman, and arguably its first wisdom celebrity. And you're going to love this. Solon once claimed that no man should be considered happy until the end of his life, because only in those later years can a person's character truly be measured. Mainstream fact: Solon lived well into his 70s, a rarity in his time, and was deeply admired not just for what he did in youth, but for the long, contemplative afterlife of those actions. His laws were designed to outlive him, much like his poems. Yes, he was a poet too, a legal philosopher with a lyre. That's what you get when you cross bureaucracy with introspection. Fringe tidbit. In one of his lesser-known fragments, Solon wrote, "I grow old always learning many things." That line became a kind of unofficial slogan for the Greek attitude toward aging. You never peaked. You evolved, like wine or marble, slowly, imperceptibly, and beautifully. There's something gently hilarious about this, too. Imagine Solon today, a retired policy wonk who moonlights as a spoken-word poet at the local library, sipping tea and shaking his head at the latest generation's lack of metrical discipline. But the ancient world believed him. His age wasn't a disqualifier. It was a credential. And by 50, you too would have been seen differently. Your voice more persuasive. Your silences more respected. Even your mistakes forgivable, because with age came narrative. You weren't just a person, you were a story. Historians still argue whether Solon's reforms were genuinely democratic or mostly aristocratic compromise. But that's less important than this. He believed society needed its elders not just to remember, but to shape what was coming. Wisdom wasn't nostalgia. It was guidance. And now, back to the olive tree. This specific one, if we're pretending, is descended from Athena's gift to the city. Remember the myth? Poseidon offered salt water. Athena offered an olive tree. The people chose the tree. The practical. The nourishing. The thing that only grows with time. That's you now. No longer salt water and spectacle. You've become that slow, resilient gift to the world. Rooted, patient, and not here to impress anyone. Just here to be. You sit down at the base of the tree. Let the stone cool your back. You breathe deeply. There's something sacred about this moment. Not because it's dramatic, but because it's undramatic. It's the kind of quiet that isn't empty. It's full. A breeze drifts by, and the leaves above you rustle in soft applause. You imagine the old philosophers watching you now, not as a student, not as a youth sprinting toward some prize, but as a peer, someone who knows that time doesn't just pass. It builds. You remember Socrates' trial, Plato's metaphors, Aristotle's ethics, Epicurus' garden, Diogenes' barrel, Solon's verses. Each one speaking not to the fleeting glory of youth, but to the lasting dignity of growing older. Not just surviving age, but stepping into it with open eyes and open arms. You're no longer auditioning for life. You're living it. And as we begin to dim the final lights of this story, you lean back just a little further into the trunk. Feel the rough bark on your palms. The way it grounds you. The way it says, you're still here, and better for it. Somewhere far away, a temple bell echoes. Or maybe that's your own breath. Slow, deliberate, almost ceremonial. The agora sleeps now. The sea hushes. The minds that once roared with theory have settled into soft memory. But you're not mourning the silence, you're savoring it. Because you know what the Greeks knew. The end of something is often just the moment it begins to matter most. And now you let go. The olive tree fades into a gentle haze, its ancient branches still whispering above you, but softer now, like the last words of a dream you almost understood. You lean further into the quiet, and the world folds inward, slow and warm and safe. Your body, once alert, now drapes itself like silk over stillness. Limbs slacken, breathing deepens. Time, that busy architect of your days, finally sets down its chisel. There is no agora now, no debate, no deadline, just the gentle hush of thought turning to mist. You remember flashes of what you heard tonight. Something about Socrates' indifference, Plato's caves, Aristotle's golden path. You don't need to hold them tightly. Just let them drift like soft coins in a fountain. They'll wait for you. Ideas always do. You think of the philosophers again, not as stone faces in old statues, but as old friends speaking low by the fire, not demanding answers, just sitting with you in the knowing silence of experience. You imagine them nodding slightly, like they've seen this moment before, 1,000 times, in 1,000 hearts. You don't have to understand it all. You just have to rest in it. Because sleep, like wisdom, isn't forced. It arrives when the questions grow quiet and the soul feels safe. And you are safe now. So close your eyes. Let your thoughts unravel gently, like scrolls in the wind. Let the night hold you, cradle you, remind you that you are still becoming, even in stillness. You've wandered through history's hush, and now, it's your turn to dream. Sleep well, philosopher.